2 Corinthians continues Paul's correspondence with his beloved but difficult church with which he had such extensive relationships. In reading 1 Corinthians, I hope it became clear that these letters of Paul do not yield to a simple analysis. They are very complex literary constructions. They need to be read again and again, preferably, as I suggested in an earlier lecture, out loud, in order that one can begin to appreciate the sort of rhetorical moves that Paul is making in his correspondence. 2 Corinthians lacks the sort of specific details about community life that we found in 1 Corinthians. We learn very little about the social realities facing the Corinthians, such as we found in the experiences that Paul addressed in that first letter. But we do find in 2 Corinthians another stage in misunderstanding, indeed of alienation, between Paul and the Corinthians. And in response to that increased alienation, we find Paul responding with his most passionate examination, one might almost say self-examination, of the meaning of the mind of Christ, to which we referred in our last lecture. You will recall that Paul in 1 Corinthians 2:16 said that we have not received a spirit which enables us to behave in a way characteristic of people in the world, that is by rivalry and competition, but we have received the spirit that comes from God, which is to be measured by the mind of Christ, that is to act in a very different fashion. In 2 Corinthians, we will see Paul examining that proposition much more deeply. In this presentation, we'll examine in turn the question of the literary integrity of 2 Corinthians, the major critical issue having to do with this letter. Secondly, the painful situation of alienation that Paul is forced to address at a major point of intersection in his ministry. And thirdly, the rhetoric of reconciliation that Paul crafts in order to meet this crisis. All contemporary scholars regard 2 Corinthians as an authentic letter of Paul. Indeed, I can scarcely think of a case in which its authenticity has been challenged. So much does it seem to ring with the tones that we associate with the authentic Paul. Indeed, it is usually categorized as one of Paul's four great letters. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans are always regarded as sort of the theological heavyweights in the Pauline canon. The critical issue having to do with 2 Corinthians is whether it is a single letter written at a single time, or whether it is many letters that have been joined together. That is, it is a question of literary integrity. We can acknowledge from the beginning that the letter is unquestionably difficult to read in a straight line from end to end. The movements of Paul and his delegates, as they are reported in this letter, are, to say the least, confusing. Paul begins an itinerary, for example, in chapter 2, tracing his intended movements and where he went, and then abruptly in 2:13, he moves to an entirely different subject for 5 chapters. And then suddenly, in chapter 7, verse 5, picks up the itinerary again. Very odd. His references to the movements of his delegate Titus are terribly obscure. He says in chapter 2, verse 12, that when he went to Troas, he couldn't find Titus. And then in 7:6, he says that when he came to Troas, he found Titus. In chapter 8, verse 18, he says he's about to send Titus to the Corinthian community. But then in chapter 12:18, he says that he had sent Titus. So where is Titus? Indeed, how many times has Paul visited this community? In chapter 1, verse 15, Paul seems to suggest that he had delayed visiting. In chapter 2, verse 1, he suggests that he had made a painful, perhaps a failed visit to this community. And then throughout the letter, we have further references to a second and a third visit, either accomplished or anticipated, that Paul envisages. In other words, we don't know what's going on here. or what has gone on between the writing of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians with reference to Paul's movements and those of his delegates. Paul's reference in chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, to a letter that he wrote to the community, that he wrote in much distress and anguish and with many tears, is equally obscure. To what is he referring? He seems to be talking about the rebuke of that brother, perhaps the one who was living in incest, but we can't be certain. In addition to these obscurities having to do with what has happened when, some scholars also detect literary seams in the letter, which they regard as indicating separate sources clumsily stitched together. Now, I must introduce this topic by reminding you that one of the great movements in scripture criticism in the last 100 years is called source criticism and form criticism, in which scholars have delighted in finding the ways in which literary compositions actually make use of earlier compositions and stitch them together. So we have theories of the sources of the Pentateuch and theories of the sources of the Gospels and so forth. That sort of eye has been brought to bear on 2 Corinthians. And so when Paul seems to make a rather dramatic rhetorical shift in chapter 9 to chapter 10. Chapter 9, he's ironic, he's purposeful, he's congratulatory, and in chapter 10, he shifts to a mode of rebuke. Some scholars see that rhetorical shift as indicating perhaps different documents. There is, secondly, a very dramatic shift in chapter 6, verse 14 to chapter 7, verse 1. And everybody, even including myself, who tends to be skeptical about source theories, recognizes the problem here. In chapter 7, 6:13, Paul, again, is embracing the Corinthians. He says, "Our hearts are wide open to you, Corinthians. Open your hearts to us." And in chapter 7, verse 2, he continues, "Open wide your hearts." Same exhortation in 6:13 and 7:2, but 6:14 to 7:1 is once more a harsh exhortation to avoid the immoral and to cast the immoral out of the community and to not associate with people who don't share the same moral standards. This is very choppy indeed, the sequence here. Then we apparently have a double treatment of the collection in chapters 8 and 9. In chapter 9, verse 1, Paul says to them, "Now, concerning the collection, I have no need to write to you." Well, that's pretty clear because he had just spent all of chapter 8 talking to them about the collection. Again, a strange combination of rhetorical moves here. The difficulties in trying to reconstruct the movements of Paul and his delegates, together with these literary seams, have led the majority of scholars today to adopt the hypothesis that 2 Corinthians is an edited composite of notes written by Paul over a period of time to the Corinthian church. 2 Corinthians, therefore, is not to be read as a single rhetorical unity, but rather to be read as a series of notes in our chronological reconstruction, as best we can do that. The idea is that somebody in the Corinthian church, after Paul's death, faced with this cache of Pauline fragments, stitched them together as best they could to form a single letter. That's the dominant hypothesis today. So we have then in 2 Corinthians, according to this view, at least 4 separate letters. The fragment hypotheses multiply, and you can find much more complex views than these, but at the very least, an irenic, peaceful letter of reconciliation, chapters 1 through 7, in which Paul, having experienced alienation with the community, is now seeking to be reconciled with them. Secondly, an interpolated fragment in chapter 6:14 to 7:1. Now, some people think, and there is merit to this suggestion, that this may in fact be that lost letter that Paul referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. Remember, In 1 Corinthians 5:9, he talked about a letter that had warned them not to associate with the immoral. Well, here we have a little fragment that warns them not to associate with the immoral. So, did a later editor interpolate this into Paul's letter? Or did perhaps Paul himself insert it into this composition for rhetorical purposes? Both suggestions have been made. Then we have chapters 8 through 10, chapters 8 through 10, which are an angry polemic concerning the rival teachers whom the Corinthians prefer to Paul. Some scholars have suggested that the degree of anger and outrage that Paul expresses here may in fact be identified with the letter written in tears. So again, we're cleaning up all the little details, you see, and making it all work. Although it's fairly clear that the letter Paul wrote in tears is a letter of rebuke to an individual. This is really a letter of anguish because the community is preferring others to himself. And then, according to the dominant hypothesis, 2 notes concerning the collection written at separate times. So all of these have been stitched together. If in fact this hypothesis is correct, then it's fairly clear why this is a difficult letter to read. It's just a jumble of notes, and in order to make sense of it, we would have to try to figure out what was the sequence here. Did Paul first write an angry letter, followed by a letter of reconciliation, followed by notes hoping to pick up the collection? Or, since there are no controls to this kind of reconstruction, did it move in the opposite direction? That's the difficulty with using these kinds of reconstructions for historical purposes. It could go either way, and so we don't know exactly what sequence was followed here in these events. Indeed, there is another possible way of reading 2 Corinthians, which is the one that I adopt. I recognize these difficulties. By no means am I trying to deny them or to minimize them. But I suggest that literary seams that other scholars take to indicate sources may also indicate rhetorical shifts, and that we can read 2 Corinthians as a single, if very daunting, literary composition, because, as I will suggest a little bit later in this lecture, even though it is difficult to follow a single argument from begin to end, it is very clear that Paul is working variations on a single theme having to do with the ministry of reconciliation. And I will try to demonstrate that as we move forward in this presentation. So what is the rhetorical situation that Paul faces? It is very difficult. At the very moment when Paul is seeking to reconcile Jew and Gentile churches through a massive collection of money, which he intends to be a symbolic gesture of reconciliation from Gentile churches to the mother church, the Jewish church in Jerusalem, at that very moment he finds his major Gentile community wants nothing to do with him. So as he's seeking to carry out reconciliation, he's facing alienation at home. Let's try to show the complexity of this situation. First of all, why should Paul want to reconcile Jew and Gentile? Why this collection of money in the first place? First of all, we know that the community in Jerusalem was not financially well off. It was an impoverished community. Secondly, we know that Paul saw that Gentiles received the good news out of that Jerusalem community. They had a certain debt to the Jerusalem community because the gospel began there. And so that was the mother church. Paul never denies that the Jerusalem church is sort of the mother church of Christianity, to which he pays real allegiance. Thirdly, there are indications that Paul's mission did receive opposition, if not from the Jerusalem church directly, from Jewish Christians out in the mission field who resented, misunderstood, and opposed Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Finally, there are deep-seated ethnic rivalries between Jew and Gentile in antiquity, which are just grounded in their very profound cultural differences. It must be remembered that anti-Semitism was not invented by Christians. It was perfected by Christians. But anti-Semitism is a reality of the Greco-Roman world as well. Because Jews were different, because they lived in communities that were closely bound and refused to enter into the, especially the polytheism of Greco-Roman life, they were subject to attack. So this Jew-Gentile harmony that Paul sought within his communities was also a division that needed to be bridged on the larger scale as well. Because this fit Paul's view of God's work as reconciling all humans. We know that the collection was important to Paul because of his frequent references to it in his correspondence and the elaborate plans he undertakes to accomplish it. In Galatians, a letter that we have not read yet, but we will soon, in the letter to the Galatians, in chapter 2, verse 10, Paul says that the centerpiece of his agreement with the Jerusalem church, the leaders in Jerusalem, concerning the legitimacy of the Gentile mission. Peter would go to the circumcised, Paul would go to the uncircumcised, was that Paul also should remember the poor, meaning the saints in Jerusalem. Something Paul says that he was already eager to do. So apparently, this was also something of a covenantal relationship between the leadership, that if Jerusalem recognized the legitimacy of Paul's mission, Paul also would help the Jerusalem community through the financial assistance from the Gentile communities. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, as we saw in a previous lecture, after Paul deals with all the tangled pastoral problems of the community, he turns to what is uppermost in his mind, namely this collection for the saints in Jerusalem. He has established travel plans. He hopes to come through Corinth, pick up that money, go through Macedonia, pick up more money, and then make his way to Jerusalem. So he wants them to make a contribution every week so that it'll be ready when he comes, and he is sending his delegate in order to oversee this collection. In 2 Corinthians, the present letter, we see that 2 full chapters are taken up with this collection and reveal Paul's embarrassment at his own manipulation of his churches. It is fairly clear in chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians that Paul has told the churches in Macedonia, Thessalonica, and Philippi, that the Corinthians are making a huge pledge. In the light of that, the Macedonians have kicked in. But now the Corinthians are reneging on their pledge. So Paul is finding himself in a very embarrassing situation with regard to this whole collection. And he's urging them to go ahead and kick in because he's made that pledge to the Macedonian church. Finally, in the letter to the Romans, which we will consider later, we see Paul in chapter 15, 19 to 31, telling the church in Rome that, in fact, he is taking up this, that he has taken up this collection, and he is now about to leave for Jerusalem to deliver the collection to the church in Jerusalem. So what we learn from this is that the Corinthians, after all, ended up liking Paul because they did kick into the collection. He says the churches in Macedonia and Achaia have kicked in, and of course the Corinthians saved Paul's letters. So ultimately, even though at this moment, when we read 2 Corinthians, he's in deep trouble with them, we see that, that ultimately it will turn out okay. 2 Corinthians does provide us some important clues as to why the Corinthians were alienated from Paul. And I remind you that not all of them were convinced that Paul was the right person to teach them in the first place. Already in 1 Corinthians, we saw that the community was divided into factions, some of whom preferred other apostles to Paul. So this is a long-standing problem which seems to have gotten much worse. 3 factors play into this increased stage of alienation. The first is the Corinthians' resentment at Paul's high-handed authoritarianism. Apparently, remember that in 1 Corinthians 4:17, Paul says, I may have to come to you with a stick. In chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians, it looks as though they're not impressed with his personal presence. So he may have come on such a threatening visit, and it may have blown up in his face. He has tried to force their obedience. Paul says in chapter 2, verse 9 of 2 Corinthians, that he was testing their obedience when he called for the excommunication of this brother who was living in incest. A community which is not all that eager to have Paul as its leader is not necessarily going to respond well when he demands something very difficult of them simply as a test of their obedience. So there may be some resentment at Paul's high-handed ways. Secondly, they think that Paul is unreliable and possibly even fraudulent in his money dealings. Remember, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul made this big deal about preaching for free. He had the right, he said, to be supported for preaching, like the other apostles, he points out, like Peter. Peter travels with a wife. Peter is supported financially. Paul says, I could do that too. That's what nature demands. That's what Torah says. That's what the Lord Jesus said, that the person who preaches the good news should be supported for this. Paul magnanimously says, nevertheless, I don't want to put any block to the gospel, so I'm preaching to you for free. As I mentioned earlier, he doesn't tell them that the Philippian church is supporting him on the side financially. And now, when he goes to Ephesus and begins to send delegates to take up this large collection, the Corinthians think that Paul is guilty of double dealing. Paul is saying one thing and doing another. Indeed, in chapter 12, verses 17 and 18, the clear suggestion is made that either Titus or Paul has defrauded them. The language is actually that of financial fraud, so that this collection may in fact be regarded as a kind of a flim-flam thing by Paul, in which he's seeking his own benefit rather than that of the church in Jerusalem. Finally, the third reason why they don't have much to do with Paul is that they actually prefer, once more, other apostles whose more powerful deeds are accompanied by a straightforward, pay-up-front kind of approach. These people are described by Paul in chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. He calls them the super apostles, somewhat sarcastically. We don't know who exactly they were. What is clear is that they claim to work powerful deeds and therefore are able to demonstrate their authority through the working of signs and wonders. What is clear is that they point to their many sufferings as a kind of demonstration of the fact that they are slaves of Christ, as they call themselves. They are spiritual athletes who have a lot of trials that they have gone through in order to demonstrate how worthy they are to be taken seriously. And since Paul refers to them contemptuously as peddlers of the word, it is clear that unlike Paul, they are willing to receive payment up front. Now, what this conflict leads us into is a very interesting debate in antiquity concerning the proper way for philosophers to deal with money. This is not simply an internal Christian theological dispute. It has to do with the social realities of antiquity. In the ancient world, as today, most philosophers either thought that wisdom, like water, should be free, that you could not put a price on wisdom, and others that, in order for people to be serious about their learning, in order to be a serious student, you have to have a tuition. You have to pay a price. And so it was very frequent for philosophers who ran a schoolroom, like Epictetus, to have students pay for each lecture. So it was an honest sort of exchange and transaction. In other words, these rival apostles, whether they were Peter and Apollos or other leaders from the Jerusalem church, or whether they were traveling Hellenistic Jewish missionaries, one thing they had to recommend them was that they were less shady in their dealings with money than Paul was. They took the money up front. So the deep paradox of Paul's situation in 2 Corinthians is that in order to carry out his cosmic ministry of reconciliation, he must first reconcile with his own community. As in many, many Christian churches today, money lies at the heart of many a divisive moment. Now, Paul's rhetoric responds to this crisis with a rhetoric that does not focus on rational proof, but on character, what ancients called an ethos argument. Ancient rhetoric recognized three kinds of argument. One that focused upon reasoned demonstration was called a logos argument. One that made an appeal to the emotions was called a pathos argument. And one that focused upon the character of the speaker or the hearers was called an ethos argument. And this is the kind of argument that Paul is making, in which he tries in various ways to present his character as imitating the character of Jesus, and then calls the community to imitate that same character. I have mentioned how difficult it is to read this letter in sequence as a single linear presentation, and that's because it is not a logos argument. Rather, Paul is ringing changes on various aspects of an ethos argument. In chapters 1 through 7, he develops the ministry of reconciliation in positive terms. He talks about the magnificence and the glory of this message that he and his fellows are carrying, and yet he also says that the glory of this mission is communicated through weak and empty vessels. Talks about his own ministry as being that of a cracked pot that carries around a magnificent treasure. He compares himself and his fellows to pallbearers. It's a shocking image, who carry around the death of Jesus in order that the life of God may be found in others. In other words, death to life, weakness to strength, foolishness to wisdom. That pattern of reciprocity. In chapters 10 through 12, he develops this ministry negatively by comparing himself to the super apostles. Again, he makes a tremendous point of the fact that they are all surface. They are all power. Paul is foolish and weak, above all because he tries to get into a boasting contest with these rival apostles, and yet he says it is precisely through that kind of weakness that God is able to work. Finally, in chapters 8 and 9, he appeals to the Corinthians to join this ministry of reconciliation through the embodied expression of the sharing of their possessions. If they become impoverished in order to make the Jerusalem church more prosperous, they will be following the same pattern of the ministry of reconciliation. So throughout this letter, Paul interweaves the story of Jesus and the character of Jesus and his own ministry of reconciliation. The structure of reconciliation is that if two people are alienated, and one is weak and one is strong, it's the stronger one who has to move. The weaker person is not able to move. So for Paul, the pattern of reconciliation is one of God reaching to human weakness to make humans stronger. The pattern is found in the death of Jesus. Jesus, who did not know sin, was made sin, Paul says in chapter 5:21, so that in him we might become God's righteousness. Paul's own ministry is one in which he seeks to make himself weak in order that they might become strong. And finally, he wants them to join this reconciling work, to be obedient to this gospel, in other words, to share that same character by engaging in the same sort of reciprocal act of reconciliation. They were reconciled by God because they received the good news about what God had done through Jesus from the Jerusalem church. They had received spiritual things from the Jerusalem church. Their reciprocal act of reconciliation is now to share their economic strength by donating to the Jerusalem church so that it also might be strengthened. We recognize that same pattern of reciprocity that we found in 1 Corinthians. But notice once more, it is the pattern of Jesus which shapes this, because Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, about Jesus, though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich.